Back at the zoo, crates were still being delivered, and Pops was still being surprised by what was in them. Ouch! Pops had done something that you should never do if you are receiving crates delivered to a zoo, especially when labels on the crate say, "These animals may bite." Although Pops had become a Christian, he still hadn't learned to obey and take notice of, notices. He had put his hand inside one of the crates, and now his fingers were being pulled off by a very sharp, very strong pliers, but pliers that could make a lot of noise. He pulled his hand out of the crate as best as he could, but the pliers would not let go. The pliers had a head attached to them, and then black and white body attached to the head, and two funny-looking wings to the body. "Penguins! They're penguins!" Pops cried. That seemed to satisfy the pair of pliers that was crushing Pops's hands. It let go of his fingers and dropped back into the crate, where it was congratulated by the other pliers for making yet another human scream in agony. "Well done, David, very observant," said the boss with a little smile on his face. "To be precise, Humboldt penguins. Now these penguins will probably refuse to eat, and if they don't eat, they will die." Pops was going to say something clever like, "Caw, is that right?" but he thought better of it. "So," Boss continued, "you must force feed them once every day with fish until they recover from their journey and are willing to eat again on their own." "How?" asked Pops, who was still trying to bring some life back into his swollen fingers. "Easy. Just catch them one at a time, sit down, put the penguin firmly between your knees, and with one hand force its beak wide open, and with the other hand push the fish down its throat. Then hold its beak shut, rub its throat until you can feel the fish go down." "Good. Now I must be going. Important things to do in the city." And with that, Boss was gone, leaving 20 penguins looking at Pops as if to say, "You just try it, mate." So the battle began. To feed a penguin, you first have to catch a penguin. At least now Pops knew why the boss hadn't filled the penguin pool with water. Penguins can swim faster than zookeepers, but zookeepers, at least fit and handsome zookeepers, can run faster than penguins. By the end of the first week, Pops's hands was covered in cuts and bruises, and his clothes covered in bits of very smelly fish and his own blood. But gradually, one by one, the penguins started to feed themselves, pick up the fish that Pops would throw to them, and they began to put on weight and look a lot fitter, all except one. Pops had noticed that there was one penguin that couldn't pick up the fish because its beak had been broken and had healed all wrong. So however hard it tried, it just could not pick up the fish from the ground. After feeding time, the rest of the penguins would waddle off, probably to discuss how boring life had become now there was no human to savage. But Percy, Pops had decided to call him Percy, just stood there looking very sad and very hungry. "Well, Percy, what are we going to do?" Pops was now talking to a penguin. Percy half turned his head and looked at Pops with one eye opened his beak. There were a few fish at the bottom of the bucket, so Pops took one out and held it out to him. Percy waddled up to Pops, took the fish out of Pops's hand. That was it, the start of a beautiful friendship. The penguin pool soon got filled with water, so most of the fish could now be caught and eaten in the water, but Percy, whenever he saw Pops come through the gate, would climb out of the water and stand beside him, and he would feed Percy by hand, maybe asking how he was doing and if the rest of the penguins had settled in. One day, when Pops was going back through the gate, Percy followed him, and as Pops turned to close the gate, they nearly bumped over each other. "Would you like to see the rest of the zoo, Percy?" asked Pops. Percy put his head to one side and looked at Pops with one eye, which in penguin language meant, "Yes, please." So Percy started following Pops around the zoo, and Pops introduced him to all the animals, except, of course, the big sea lions, because sea lions love penguins, especially for an afternoon treat. But Percy knew he was always safe because he was with his friend Pops. Because of his broken beak, Percy was different from the rest of the penguins, just like sometimes Pops felt he was different from the rest of his new Christian friends. They seemed so much better than he was. They talked more easily, and they knew a lot more stuff than he did. All of them were set to go off to university. They lived in bigger houses and had gone to posher schools. Sometimes Pops felt embarrassed when he was invited round to their homes and would say something stupid when one of their parents asked something about himself. But Pops learnt that he could trust Jesus. As Percy trusted Pops, he became less and less self-conscious. The broken beak didn't bother Percy. In fact, what could have been a disaster for him turned out to be the best thing that could have ever happened. Now he could walk freely round the zoo whenever he wanted to, or just swim the rest of his penguin friends, and all the time knowing that Pops was always there looking out for him. As Pops started to read the Bible, he was realising that it had taken much more than a few cuts and bruises on his hands to rescue Pops. Jesus had laid his life down for him. Those first friends of Pops, even after 50 years, although he doesn't see them much now, are still some of his best friends Pops has ever had. But Jesus has been the best friend of all. He said, "I will never leave you or forsake you." And Pops has proved that to be true over and over again.